Hello and welcome to Byju's IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at an editorial from page number 8 of the Delhi edition. This editorial deals with the anti-dumping duties that India recently imposed against 5 Chinese products. If you remember, I had covered this topic in slight detail a couple of days ago in our daily quiz. We had understood what exactly are anti-dumping duties and what purpose do they serve in protecting our domestic industries. So today, let's have a more elaborate discussion on this topic, beginning with a discussion on anti-dumping duties. See, anti-dumping duty is a type of a protectionist tariff that is imposed against a practice known as dumping. Dumping of goods is a process wherein a company which is exporting a product is deliberately pricing that product at a significantly lower price than it normally charges in its domestic market. So, when an exporter from another country is deliberately bringing down the prices and selling it in our market below the fair market value, then that product will have the potential to wipe out the domestic products being produced within our country. This practice constitutes dumping, and it has been recognized by the World Trade Organization as an unfair trade practice. Because the practice of dumping of goods can have a distortive effect on international trade. And when a product imported from another country at such a cheap price is being sold in our market, then our domestically produced goods won't be able to compete with the cheaper imports that are coming in through the dumping route. So, to enable a country to protect their domestic industries against the practice of dumping, the WTO has recognized an anti dumping instrument known as anti dumping duties. So, if a domestic government is convinced that a particular product is being dumped on its market, that is, if the foreign imports are being sold at below the fair market price, then this government reserves the right to impose a protectionist tariff against this imported product. So, by imposing this protectionist tariff, the price of the imported product can be raised, thereby giving a breathing space for our domestic producers to survive and compete against the cheaper imports that are coming in. So, in the recent incident involving India and China, India has detected the dumping of 5 Chinese products on the Indian market, and accordingly, the Central Board of Indirect Taxes and Customs, under the Ministry of Finance, has notified the imposition of anti dumping duties against these 5 Chinese products. These items included flat rolled aluminum products for solar modules, silicon sealants, which are used in the manufacturing of solar photovoltaic modules, and also the hydrofluorocarbon components used in refrigeration. Last year, Indian authorities noticed that these products were being dumped on the Indian market, and subsequently the DGTR, or the Directorate General of Trade Remedies, which is under the Commerce Ministry, had launched anti-dumping investigations in September 2020. Through these investigations, the DGTR concluded that these products are being dumped on the Indian market. That is, they were being sold below the fair market price, which essentially constitutes the practice of dumping as per the definition of WTO. So once the DGTR established that this constituted dumping, it recommended the imposition of anti-dumping duties, and accordingly the CBIC has notified the imposition of this protectionist tariff in order to protect the domestic industry. See, as per the rules, anti-dumping duties, once they are imposed, they will stay in effect for 5 years, after which it is again reviewed and a further decision is taken whether to continue the duties or to revoke them. So these duties have been sanctioned by the WTO as a safeguard for a country to protect itself against these unfair trade practices which could adversely harm the domestic producers. So India has been using anti-dumping duties as an effective trade weapon against cheap Chinese imports to protect the domestic producers. According to data provided by the Commerce Ministry, until February 2020, around 90 Chinese products were brought under the anti-dumping duty regime of India. Apart from this, 24 other Chinese products are under investigation by the DGTR, and recently 5 more have been brought under the list. So the editorial says that imposing anti dumping duties against the practice of dumping is definitely a warranted measure, which is even approved by the WTO, and it is even beneficial for a country like India to protect its domestic industries. But however, if anti dumping duties are imposed unwisely, and if the policy is taken up as a reflexive action just for the sake of restricting Chinese imports into the country, then anti dumping duties can actually have long term adverse consequences as well. See, to understand this argument further, you should know the pattern of trade that exists between India and China. Today, India and China have a very strong trading relationship, and China has even emerged as India's largest trading partner. In most years, the trading volume is more than $100 billion, but every year there is a massive trade deficit which goes against India. In most years, the trade deficit has been nearly $50 billion, which is a result of limited Indian exports to China, whereas Chinese imports continue to flood the Indian market. So, on one hand, the Indian government has been trying for many years to restrict Chinese imports in order to contain and bring down this trade deficit. But ideally, this cannot be done by restricting imports through the imposition of anti dumping duties. Because anti dumping duties have been sanctioned by the WTO for a specific purpose. It is meant to provide immediate relief to those domestic producers who are facing an existential crisis because of the cheaper imports that are coming in. This is the immediate purpose that anti dumping duties are supposed to serve. But if it is imposed blindly against any import just to bring down the trade deficit, then it might unfairly benefit few domestic producers in India, which already have a large monopoly in that particular sector. Let's say there is a Chinese import which is undergoing anti dumping investigation, and if the same product is being produced by a domestic rival, and if this domestic producer is already a very large company, and if it is resilient to withstand any shock, and if it already has a monopoly in the market, then in such cases, if anti dumping duties are blindly imposed against Chinese imports, it could unfairly benefit the domestic producer. This would further allow the domestic producer to perpetuate their monopoly in the market, and this will have several long term adverse consequences for the domestic market. So, in such a case, when anti dumping duty is placed on the Chinese products, the domestic producer will further strengthen their monopoly, and it will directly contribute to the erosion of domestic competition. This in turn affects the downstream industries which are dependent on the producer, and it also affects the consumers as the prices and even the quality of the product will be solely determined by the monopoly. So, in such cases, subjecting the large domestic producer to international competition is actually healthy because it helps in keeping the monopolistic tendencies in check and also helps in nurturing domestic competition. This will benefit the downstream industries and as well as the consumers. So the editorial says that imposing anti dumping duties against the Chinese practice of dumping goods on India is definitely warranted and beneficial, but only in certain cases. That is, only when domestic producers are facing a survival crisis or an existential crisis. These duties are meant to provide immediate short term relief. But if it is imposed unwisely, then it will have a long term adverse effect. This is where India has to fine tune its process of anti dumping investigation. Because if immediate short term relief has to be provided, then the anti dumping investigation has to be speeded up. But unfortunately, right now, the DGTR is very slow in its investigation because it is facing a massive resource crunch and it doesn't have enough personnel to conduct timely and effective investigations. For example, the 5 Chinese products which have been recently brought under anti dumping duties, they have been under investigation for more than 1 year. It means that the domestic producers have already been affected and they did not get any immediate relief from the government. Then India should also be mindful that the pandemic has caused a radical shift in the global economy. The pandemic clearly exposed the supply chain risks that existed, as the global supply chains were heavily dependent on Chinese manufacturing. So, ever since the pandemic and ever since China started weaponizing trade, several global producers and importers they have started shifting away from China. So, this leaves behind a massive surplus manufacturing capacity for China, and China would definitely look to exploit this by producing more cheap goods, which it is likely to dump on the Indian market in the coming years. So, if the dumping of Chinese goods go up in the future, India will have to gear up for this possibility, conduct swift investigations, and provide immediate relief to those producers who are facing an existential crisis. But otherwise, if India is just using anti dumping duties to bring down the trade deficit and to just benefit the large monopolies that already exist, then it is going to have several long term adverse consequences for the domestic economy. Now, let's take up a column from page number 8 in which the writers talk about the criminalization of Indian politics. They argue that the high levels of criminalization of Indian politics has weakened and destroyed the Indian democracy, and it also affects the well being of the individual. So, to understand these arguments being made by the writers, we need to have an elaborate discussion on this important topic. See, the entry and rise of criminals in Indian politics has become a constant theme. It essentially means that we have a large number of criminals participating in our political process, and they are not only contesting elections, but they are even getting elected as MPs and MLAs. This disturbing trend has been noticed since independence, and it has only sustained over the decades. Because, on one hand, political parties seek out those candidates who bring money, power, and muscle power to the party to win them elections and seats, thus facilitating the entry of criminals. And on the other hand, criminals are also seeking entry into politics so that they can protect and grow their criminal activities. So, this excessive criminalization of Indian politics has taken place primarily due to the nexus between politicians and criminals. According to data that was brought out by the Association for Democratic Reforms, 233 MPs in the current Lok Sabha are facing criminal charges. If you notice the trend of the previous Lok Sabhas, you will see that the number of MPs with criminal records has gone up significantly, and this problem is more serious at the level of state assemblies. For example, if you look at the recent assembly elections held in the states of Assam, Kerala, Puducherry, Tamil Nadu, and West Bengal, you will notice that more than 1,000 candidates who were fielded by political parties had criminal cases against them. So we need to understand what are the reasons behind this criminalization of Indian politics. We need to know why are political parties seeking out criminal candidates, and why do people with criminal records seek an entry into politics? See, first and foremost, the Indian state has not been able to deal with criminalization of politics due to the lack of political will. Since independence, political parties have been known for entertaining criminal candidates, and because of the quid pro quo arrangement or the mutual benefit arrangement they have, political parties are reluctant to act against the trend. Then, even though we have several laws and even court judgments that could help in preventing criminalization of politics, there is a complete lack of enforcement by the ruling parties. And this clearly points to the nexus that exists between politicians and criminals. So, one might suggest, why don't we just disqualify politicians with a criminal record? Why don't we just ban them from contesting elections? See, in this regard, the Indian constitution does not specify as to what disqualifies a person from contesting elections. But however, the Representation of People's Act of 1951 mentions the specific criteria for disqualifying a person from contesting elections. Section 8 of the Act states that disqualification on conviction for certain offences, according to which an individual punished with a jail term of more than 2 years cannot stand in an election for 6 years after the jail term has ended. So it essentially means that the RPA provides for disqualification only after conviction for a criminal offense. That is, only if a candidate has been convicted for the offense and has been jailed for more than 2 years, only then they are prohibited from standing for elections for 6 years after their jail term ends. So this essentially allows those candidates who are just facing criminal charges to continue contesting in elections. Even if these are very grave criminal charges, including rape and murder, the candidates get an opportunity to contest as long as they are convicted for these offenses. So essentially, the existing law does not prohibit any individual who have criminal charges pending against them from contesting elections. So hence, when these candidates get elected to the parliament and the state legislature, they are not disqualified until they are convicted in these cases. However, the Supreme Court has made very serious observations about this trend and has strongly expressed its displeasure in several cases and judgments. But the Supreme Court has not directly intervened in the matter as it does not want to step into the domain of the legislature. However, the Supreme Court has mandated all political parties to publish the criminal history of their candidates so that the voters are aware as to on what grounds political parties are encouraging criminal candidates. Apart from that, the Supreme Court has placed the responsibility on the Election Commission of India to ensure more transparency in this regard. It has directed the Election Commission to come out with an online platform where parties are mandated to declare the criminal history of their candidates. It has even been suggested that the Election Commission can set up a separate cell to monitor the compliance of parties in this regard. Then, apart from these factors, the narrow self interests and the divisions in the Indian society, and the use of muscle and money power, they have all perpetuated the criminalization of Indian politics. See, this trend has been sustained not just by our political parties and by the system, but it has even been sustained by the voters. Because even today, a large number of voters are heavily influenced by divisive topics and polarizing issues such as caste and religion. So, those voters who cast their vote on the basis of caste, religion, and power, they continue voting for those candidates who they consider to represent their interests, despite these candidates having a criminal record. So, several voters prefer such candidates just because they are strong and powerful to protect the interests of their caste and religion, despite them being aware that these candidates have a criminal record. And as I mentioned earlier, several political parties, both national parties and regional parties, they not only admit candidates with criminal records into their parties, but they even provide them with election tickets because they're all drawn by their muscle power and money power. Political parties know that such strong candidates who might have a criminal record, they will bring the necessary muscle power into the party and the required money to contest elections, which in turn guarantees more seats to the parties in the parliament and the legislature. So these are the various factors which have contributed to the excessive criminalization of Indian politics. But our inability to stem this trend has disastrous consequences for our democracy and as well as for the society. See, tolerating and encouraging the criminalization of politics goes against the principle of free and fair elections. Because candidates with a criminal record are known to bring their muscle and money power into elections, which they use to manipulate elections in their favor. This completely shakes the very bedrock of a democracy and erodes the principle of free and fair elections. And once such criminal candidates are elected, it will obviously affect good governance. Because this is a case where lawbreakers are becoming lawmakers and it perpetuates their criminal and corrupt practices into our institutions and as well as it affects the integrity of our government servants. Because many of these criminal candidates, they work in collusion with their parties and they openly breed corruption within government institutions and amongst government servants, thus increasing corruption in the society and as well as affecting the delivery of services and governance. Then, as criminal candidates are used to breeding a culture of violence, it also affects social disharmony. Such candidates are known to deliver hate speech against other minorities, and this will lead to further polarization of the society on caste and religious lines. So, such increase in violence, polarization, corruption, and the eventual failure of governance destroys the faith of the public in the democracy, and people start losing faith in our government institutions. This is exactly the argument being made by the writers. They are arguing that the excessive criminalization of Indian politics has not only weakened the Indian democracy, but it is also affecting the well being of the citizens. Because studies have shown that well meaning citizens who are frustrated with the criminalization of politics, they start losing faith and they start losing trust in our politicians, in our governments, and in our public institutions. This nexus facilitates the breeding of corruption, and there could also be several voters who could start encouraging this trend as it suits their respective self interests. So, people of different castes, religions, and communities they might start encouraging this trend, and even they could become a part of the nexus as it will help them safeguard their respective interests. This will eventually degrade governance, rise corruption, even increase violence and social disharmony, thereby affecting the overall well being of the individual. So, then what is the way forward? How do we deal with such excessive criminalization of Indian politics? There are a few suggestions that we could provide in our answers, which includes the implementation of recommendations of various committees, such as Dinesh Goswami Committee and the Inderjeet Committee, which dealt with electoral reforms. Many of these committees have recommended the state funding of elections, which could help in curbing the use of black money, thereby bringing down the need for corruption and thus limiting the criminalization of politics. Then the Election Commission of India has to be further strengthened and made more autonomous so that it can clean up the electoral process and push for electoral reforms, which will help in holding our political parties more accountable if they are encouraging criminal candidates. The responsibility also lies with the voters because we as citizens have to be more vigilant about how the political parties are encouraging such criminalization. If voters stop voting on the lines of caste and religion, it will go a long way in preventing the criminalization of politics. If voters are not influenced by money, gifts, and populist policies, even this will help in keeping the parties under check and helps in holding them accountable if they are encouraging criminal candidates. Then, since our parties are reluctant to act on their own, and since they refuse to bring any transparency to their functioning, and as they are seen to be encouraging criminalization of politics, probably the time has come for the Indian judiciary to step in and take a few serious measures along with the Election Commission to curb this trend. Then finally, since the disqualification of such candidates is based on their conviction in criminal cases, there is a need for the criminal justice system to fast track these cases so that political candidates with a criminal background who have been quickly convicted can be disqualified from the system. Now let's look at this article from page number 10. In the last few months, at least two Supreme Court judges have expressed a desire to Indianize the legal system. This opinion was expressed by none other than the Chief Justice of India N.V. Ramanna and Supreme Court Justice S. Abdul Nazir. They have both opined that the Indian legal and judicial system is heavily influenced by colonial practices. Such a colonial legal and judicial system is not relevant to the Indian context, and India is no longer bound to colonial practices and traditions. They have also argued that India's rural issues and social issues are completely detached from the European context of colonial laws and colonial judicial system, and hence they have called for decolonization of India's legal system. They have observed that there is a need to Indianize the Indian legal system by drawing references from our own experience and as well as from ancient jurisprudence. The Chief Justice of India had stated that there is an urgent need to Indianize the legal and judicial system in order to adapt to the practical realities of our society. So, according to the Chief Justice of India, When it comes to justice delivery, there is a need to localize our systems to suit the local context of India. Then recently, Justice Abdul Nasir remarked that there are great legal traditions and jurisprudence in ancient and medieval India, and one needs to draw those references from ancient Indian texts. He has referred to the works of ancient and medieval thinkers like Manu, Kautilya, etc., and he has called for inculcating these references into the Indian legal system. So, in this context, the writer of the article points out that the Indian judiciary has already been making a conscious effort from several years to get rid of its colonial influence and introduce a local context in order to Indianize the legal system. According to the writer of the article, there have been several judgments in the past, and there have been several judicial and legal mechanisms that have been evolved within India that already points towards the ongoing Indianization of the legal system. For example, Article 141 of the Constitution and public interest litigation are entirely unique Indian innovations. Under Article 141, the Supreme Court is empowered to issue binding directions to the executive. Now, this is a uniquely Indian feature. Then, even PIL or public interest litigation, where a common man can raise key issues in the Supreme Court, is a uniquely Indian innovation. Plus, there are also several judgments of the Supreme Court in the past where the judges have referred to ancient Indian texts for inspiration and for reference. For example, in the landmark K.S. Puttaswamy case, where right to privacy was declared as a fundamental right, Justice S.A. Bobde had referred to the works of Kautilya's Arthashastra. Then, in another landmark case, where adultery was decriminalized by the court, that is the Joseph Shine judgment, the judges had drawn references from the Manusmriti. A similar reference was drawn in the controversial Sabrimala case as well, where references were made to the observations made in the Manusmriti. So, according to the writer, these instances show that the judiciary is already making a conscious effort to get rid of colonial influence and to inculcate more Indian practices and traditions into our legal system. Now, let's look at this article from page number 13. Chinese space station has close shave with Elon Musk satellites. And following this incident, Beijing has complained against the United States to the UN over the irresponsible conduct of the US government and the American company. See, the Chinese space station, known as the Tiangong, is currently in orbit, and reportedly, it had a very close encounter with two American satellites. These American satellites in question were launched by a company known as SpaceX, which is the space venture of popular entrepreneur Elon Musk. SpaceX has started an ambitious project known as the Starlink. Under this project, SpaceX is launching thousands of satellites into low Earth orbit, and these small satellites are designed to provide internet connectivity in remote parts of the Earth. But the Starlink project of SpaceX has been very controversial because it is increasing space traffic and space debris as thousands of small satellites are being launched into low Earth orbit. This is likely to interfere with the path of other spacecrafts, and many countries have already raised an issue about this. So, reportedly, China's space station had a close encounter with the Starlink satellites, which are launched and owned by an American space company. So, China has termed this as irresponsible behavior on the part of the US government and has stated that this is a violation of the Outer Space Treaty. Because the Outer Space Treaty regulates activities in space and places obligations on the member countries. And as per the Outer Space Treaty, the governments are responsible not just for their activities, but they're also responsible for the space activities of non-government entities as well. So essentially, if an American private space company is taking part in space activities, then even this private firm has to abide by the regulations of the Outer Space Treaty. If the private company is violating the regulations, then the responsibility falls on the US government to ensure that Even its non-government entities abide by the Outer Space Treaty regulations. So the Outer Space Treaty allows other countries to hold a member state accountable even for the activities of non-state entities. So in this context, let's take a brief look at the provisions of Outer Space Treaty. This treaty is formally known as Treaty on Principles Governing the Activities of States in the Exploration and Use of Outer Space, including the Moon and other celestial bodies. It is essentially a multilateral treaty that provides the basis for international space law. It was negotiated, drafted, and signed under the United Nations, and it came into effect in 1967. Today, more than 111 countries are parties to the treaty and includes all major spacefaring nations, including India. The need for such a treaty was felt in the 1950s during the peak of the Cold War, when an arms race and a space race had emerged between the two superpowers, that is, the United States and the Soviet Union. As they started launching intercontinental ballistic missiles, which enters outer space, and as they started launching satellites into orbit, a need was felt for a space treaty to restrict and prohibit the usage of outer space for military purposes. So accordingly, the treaty was negotiated under the UN and it came into force in 1967. Some of its key provisions include prohibiting the placement of nuclear weapons in outer space. It also limits the usage of moon and other celestial bodies only for peaceful purposes and prohibits any military activities. It establishes that space shall be freely explored and used by all nations, thus establishing outer space as a global common. This is very similar to how the Antarctic region is treated. The Antarctic region doesn't belong to any country, but it is part of the global commons. Then the Outer Space Treaty also precludes any country from claiming sovereignty in outer space or even over any celestial body. But even though the treaty takes a stand against the establishment of any military bases or testing weapons and conducting military activities, it does not explicitly ban all military activities in outer space. That's the reason why many major countries they have their own space force, including India. Recently, India has established a defense space agency, quite similar to the space force that has been established by major powers like US, Russia, and China. Then these four major space powers have even tested conventional weapons in space, including anti-satellite weapons. But however, with regard to the newspaper article that we were looking at, Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty becomes very relevant for us. This article states that activities of non-governmental entities in outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, shall require the authorization and continuing supervision of the appropriate member state. It essentially means that the member states, that is, the respective governments, shall bear international responsibility for the actions of their respective non-government entities. So, in this regard, if China feels that its international space station was threatened by the irresponsible conduct of an American private space company, then it has the right to hold the US government accountable as per the Outer Space Treaty. Next, we have a few repeat articles in today's newspaper, which we have already covered in detail in our previous sessions. For example, there is a column on page number 9 that refers to the fishermen dispute between India and Sri Lanka. I have covered this topic in complete detail on the 6th of May, and the link for the same will be shared below, so you can go through this video once and then read the column. This topic helps you understand the maritime zones that divide India and Sri Lanka and the fishermen conflict that exists between the two countries. So I've explained this topic in detail on the 6th of May, so please watch the video once and then go through the column. Then on the same page, there's a column written by Gopal Krishna Gandhi, the grandson of Mahatma Gandhi and a former Indian diplomat, and as well as a former governor, in which he pays tribute to Desmond Tutu, who recently passed away. Just a couple of days ago, on the 27th of December, I had explained in detail the life, works, and contribution of Desmond Tutu as part of our discussion under Fact of the Day in our daily quiz. Desmond Tutu not only led the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa along with Nelson Mandela, but was also heavily influenced by Gandhian principle of non-violence. So I have explained this in detail on the 27th of December in our daily quiz. So please watch the video and then you can go through the column. Then on page 17 of the online edition of the Hindu, there is a detailed article explaining the objectives of the James Webb Space Telescope. Again, this topic has been covered on the 25th of December in our daily quiz. So I would request you to watch the video and then take a look at this infographic. Now let's look at the mains practice questions. The first question: anti-dumping duties can be an effective trade weapon to protect domestic industries, but it could also have adverse consequences when applied unwisely. Examine in the context of India-China trade relationship. The second question: high levels of criminality in politics could wreck India's democracy. Discuss. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the answer writing portal, for which the link shall be given in the description box below. So this concludes our discussion for today. Thanks for watching.